Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another live online professional development seminar in Bringing History Alive, your Teaching American History project from Osceola County. Tonight's topic is Your Revolution and Mine, Native Americans, African Americans, and the War for Independence. I'm Richard Schramm, Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and as in the past, I'll be moderating our session this evening. Before we get underway, I just want to remind you that our latest toolbox, we've told you about our online toolboxes before. We've got a new one coming out. It'll be available in just a matter of days. It's called Making the Revolution, very pertinent to the topic we're taking tonight. It will have a rich array of primary documents for you, sermons, broadside poems, stories, maps, images. Many of these will be available online for the first time. They come with notes and discussion questions, and we hope that you'll take a look at that and use it in your instruction. As always, we're going to be sending you a documentation of participation for your participation in the seminar tonight. You can present that to your local certifying authority for whatever recertification credit this program warrants. Are there any questions before we get underway? Any business from our last seminar? Any questions about this evening's seminar? Any questions in general? If we're ready to go, send me a smiley face. Let me see that you're all on board. There we go. Always encouraging to see that, because you see that there really are people out there. Sometimes doing these seminars, you feel as if you're talking into a well. Great. Okay, so then let's proceed. The goals of our seminar this evening are, as always, quite simple. We want to explore how the American Revolution affected Native Americans and African Americans, and we want to understand the role they played in it. We're also going to introduce you to some fresh primary documents for use with your students. Now, the form, there's just one comment really on the form, and I think it's a general problem perhaps that teachers have. I know when we were setting the seminar up, our seminar presenter tonight, Alan Taylor, and I were talking about this, and his students too feel very disconnected from people in this period. So he's going to consider, as we go through the seminar tonight, how we can foster a sense of connection and promote student engagement. Alan teaches at the University of California at Davis. He was a fellow here at the National Humanities Center in 1993 and 94. He's written widely on colonial history and Revolutionary War history. You can see some of his titles there. We couldn't get them all on the slide. And we are very pleased to have him with us tonight. And I really mean that, because apparently just a few minutes before the seminar began, the internet services at the University of California at Davis collapsed. So we didn't know if we were going to be able to do this seminar tonight. Happily, he's with us, though, and I've turned the program over to him. So, Alan, it is all yours.
Thank you very much, Richard, and welcome everybody who's participating. I'm very happy to work with you today. And so I just wanted to say something about the opening question, because I think that young people in general do struggle to identify with the revolutionary generation. And in part, it's because that generation's leaders have been put up on a pedestal and they just seem unapproachable. And so what I try to do in my teaching is to restore a sense of drama to that period of time, to show that these were human beings who struggled with very difficult issues. And two of the issues that were particularly difficult were, first, how would this new nation deal with Native peoples on its frontier? And second, how would they deal with the slave system, which had become so essential to the economy of much of the United States? And in dealing with both of these, they face contradictions with their greatest principles, and above all, the statement that all men are created equal. They found it very difficult to reconcile that statement with the realities of slavery and the reality of conflict along the frontier. And let me also just say that if anybody has a question or comment, I don't mind pausing and addressing the question. Let me also say that I'm going to be showing you a set of images, and then we will go into a set of documents. And the first document that we're going to look at is something called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And one of the things this proclamation did was to establish a line in which it demarcated settlement and said that settlers were to stay east of that line. And you will see the line here on this map, and it approximately runs along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. And then it also includes the province of Quebec, which the British had recently conquered. One of the prime reasons for issuing this proclamation is the British are trying to decide how they would administer all of this new land that they had recently added to the empire. They had fought this war, we call it the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. They had fought this war during the 1750s and early 1760s. Before that war, essentially the 13 colonies had been limited by the Appalachian Mountains. They had no settlement to the west of those mountains. And the country to the west belonged to native peoples. And those native peoples were overwhelmingly allied with the French, who were based up in Canada. In this war, the British and their colonial allies won a massive victory, and they ousted the French from the continent. So that after the war, the new boundary for the British Empire in the west was the Mississippi River. And there was no boundary to the north. The British Empire extended all the way to the polar regions. They then had to decide what they were going to do about settlers moving to the west. And the British decided that that settlement actually threatened to unleash new wars with Indian peoples. And the British were trying to cut their costs and reduce the number of their soldiers. And so they drew this proclamation line of 1763. When we get to the document, we'll talk about the language and what the implications of that line would be for the colonists. The second slide shows the spread of colonial settlement. And you can see that as of 1760, at the end of this war between the French and the British and native peoples, that colonial settlement really hadn't reached through the Appalachian Mountains. You can see some little pockets of brown settlement in the Mississippi Valley and around the Great Lakes, and those were all little enclaves of French settlement around trading posts. Anglo-Americans had not gotten west of the mountains, except for you see a little red splash that has just reached the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, south of Lake Erie. But during the next decade, there will be a growth of settlement in what's Kentucky, which you'll find where the word backcountry appears, and a little bit in Tennessee. And all of this is very troubling to Indian peoples and to the British Empire, for both the empire and the native peoples want to keep the settlers east of the mountains. Now, here's a wonderful image that was made in the middle of the 19th century, and it shows the process of settlement. And here in this one image, you can see all of these activities of settlers all crammed into the picture. And it shows you the many ways in which settlement is changing the environment and making an environment that is no longer hospitable to native peoples and their way of using nature. So you can notice here, front and center, you've got a colonist chopping down a tree. There's going to be massive deforestation as a consequence of settlement. To the left, you see a man who is harnessing horses. So the introduction of domesticated, privately owned livestock by the thousands is going to have a massive environmental consequence. To the right, you can see a woman who is cooking over a fire. So one of the things that's driving deforestation is the fuel. The prime fuel for these settlers is wood. In the background, you can see they're building a log cabin. So they're turning these newly dead trees into housing for themselves. So this is an image that highlights that it takes a whole family to engage in building a farm in the frontier. It's a massive amount of work, and it has a very powerful impact on the environment.
So, Alan, to put this in 21st century terms, you might say that this is habitat destruction for Native Americans.
Well, certainly it is. It's a different sort of nature that's being substituted, one that's much more managed by these settlers, and is going to reduce the wild animals and the wild plants in favor of a relatively few domesticated plants and domesticated animals.
So the domestication of the landscape then drove the Indians farther and farther west.
That's true. Now, certainly Indian peoples are trying to resist this because they don't want to see their way of life destroyed by being pushed out. And they don't really, it's not easy for them just to go west, because when they do, they're being pushed into the countries of other Indians who don't really want to share. There are many different Indian nations. They don't all speak the same language, and they don't see themselves as one united people. They see themselves as many different nations.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
Sure. And now, one of the principal leaders of Native peoples during the American Revolution is this man. His Mohawk name was Thayendanegea. His English name was Joseph Brant, and he had been baptized. He practiced the Anglican form of Christianity. And this painting was made in London in 1776, where Brant has gone at the very start of the Revolution. And he is there to lobby the British government to take in various Indian nations, including his nation, the Mohawks, as allies in this war. And in return, they will help them to fight against the rebel colonists. Now, the reason the Indians are doing this is that they believe that the British Empire and the native peoples have a common enemy, which is these settlers expanding westward. And so they're hoping that if the empire can win, can suppress the rebellion, and can restore the empire in North America, that Indian nations will be rewarded by an enforcement of the Proclamation line of 1763. Now, during the Revolution, most native peoples allied with the British Empire and helped them. This image, many of you may have seen. It's often reproduced in textbooks. It's a very chilling and grim picture. It was painted by John Vanderlyn of New York. It's painted in 1804, so in the generation after the Revolution. The central figure is Jane McCrae, and she was a woman. She was actually the fiancée of a Loyalist. Now, a Loyalist was an American who, in this Civil War that we call the Revolution, was siding with the Empire. And she was trying to reach her fiancé, who was with a British force that was invading New York from Canada. And on the way, she was ambushed and seized by Indians who quarreled over her, and they ended up killing her. Now, this was a real episode. It was seized upon by the Patriots for propaganda to make the point that the British had allied with Indian peoples and that Indians were savages. And Vanderlyn's painting, this I have to emphasize, is not a photograph. This was not done at the time. This is a painting that took some time to create, is making a very grim point, which is you can see it highlights the powerful bodies of these Indian warriors, and it highlights their darker skin color, and it highlights the lighter skin color of Jane McCrae, and it highlights her vulnerability. So this was the primary way in which people of the United States thought about Indians. They thought of them as warriors, and they thought of them as violent, and they thought of them as very dangerous and as another race. And so they saw the American Revolution as, in part, not just a war against Britain, but also a war against Indians. And they saw Indians as deserving to be dispossessed. Now, one of the, this is a somewhat happier image that comes out of the Revolution. This is a John Trumbull painting, and it shows the death of an American general. He's the central figure here who's dying in the arms of one of his aides. It's an American general named Richard Montgomery, who was actually from Ireland. He'd been born in Ireland. He'd been a British officer in the British Army. But he migrated to the colonies shortly before the Revolution, and he embraced the Patriot cause. So he is leading a Patriot attack on the city of Quebec. This painting, some of you may recognize, is very similar to a famous Benjamin West painting of the death of General Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham. The British had captured the city of Quebec in 1759. A very famous British painting by Benjamin West showed this British general dying in the moment of victory. So here Trumbull is in some ways copying that painting by putting a dying American general dying very close to where Wolfe died, but in a moment of defeat. But it's presented as a glorious defeat. But the figure I want to call to your attention is just to the left of where you see the dying General Montgomery, and it's an Indian figure. And this was a man known as Colonel Louie. And Colonel Louie considered himself to be a Mohawk Indian. He, however, joined the Oneida Indians during the war because the Mohawks had sided with the British, but the Oneidas sided with the Americans. They were a very rare Indian nation that supported the Patriot cause. And so he's part of this expedition. Now, Colonel Louie is especially interesting because he had been born a colonist. He was, in fact, a mulatto. He was part black and part white. He'd been captured during the previous war, adopted by the Mohawks in Canada, learned their language, learned their culture, because he was just a young boy when captured. He will become a patriot, join the Oneidas, fight beside the Patriots through the whole war, and he will be given an officer's commission in the Continental Army as a colonel. And that's why he's called Colonel Louie. Now that's interesting, among other reasons, in that he is the only person of African-American descent to hold an officer's commission in the Continental Army during the Revolution. And he held this because he was considered, first and foremost, to be an Indian and a very influential one who could help to rally an important group of warriors to help the United States in this war.
Okay, Laura would just like some clarification on that, Alan. Was he an Indian or an African-American or both?
Well, he's both. He considers himself an Indian, and that culturally he's an Indian, and Indians had the practice of adopting all sorts of people, including people we might call white or we might call black. So he thinks he's an Indian. But by the people of the United States, when they were happy with Colonel Louie, they would call him an Indian, and when they weren't happy with him, they'd call him a mulatto. So he's caught in these kind of conflicting racial categorization that existed at that time.
Mm-hmm. And let me pose a question. Why did the Oneidas side with the Patriots?
Well, the Oneidas had a particular missionary who worked with them, a man named Samuel Kirkland. And Kirkland was very committed to the Patriot cause. That's one reason. Now, the other reason was the Oneidas had a sense of rivalry with the Mohawks, and they felt that the Mohawks were given a lot of favor by the British. And so when the Mohawks embraced the British cause, the Loyalist cause during the Revolution, that kind of tipped the Oneidas towards saying, well, we're going to ally with the Patriots and hope that we will benefit from allying with the Patriots, and we hope to help the Patriots win.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Shall I go on, or
yeah,
are there any other questions about
stop.
this?
Okay, let's just stop for a moment here and see if there are any questions. We've had a few come up. A number of people have said that the last few images, the one of Jane McCrae and the one of the family building the house in the wilderness, would be working very well with students. If you have any questions any questions that you can suggest that you would use with your students to lead into those into a discussion of those works of art, let us know. Share them with your colleagues. And here Laura writes, here he's shown with his tomahawk raised. What does that show? And is he called Colonel Louis, L-O-U-I-S, the French spelling, or perhaps L-E-W-I-S? So is there any particular significance to the raised tomahawk?
Well, first of all, he was called Louis, but it was pronounced Louis, so everybody called it Colonel Louis at that time, which was the French pronunciation of what we would call Louis. He does have a Native American name. I would just butcher it if I did it at this point, but he's featured in my book, The Divided Ground. So if you're interested in knowing more about him, both during the Revolution and after the Revolution, you can find him in The Divided Ground, and you can find his full native name there. Now, he's raising the tomahawk. There are a couple of reasons why the artist has done this. One is that's one of the symbols of being an Indian warrior, is to have a tomahawk. So in the preceding image, we had seen this with Jane McCrae. The tomahawk is a symbol of the Indian, and here Indians are presented as enemies. In the next picture, we have Colonel Louie. He's presented as an American ally, but he's also presented as a warrior, so he has the tomahawk, and that's why it's raised.
Okay. Okay, then shall we move on?
Okay. So now we're going to go into the documents, and we will deal with a set of documents which are about the Native participation in the war. Then when we finish these documents, I'll show you a few images about the African American participation. And then we will go to a set of documents about African Americans in the Revolution.
Okay, Alan, before we do that, people are really interested in Colonel Louie. So let me put Amy's question to you. What happened to Colonel Louie? What was his fate?
Well, Colonel Louie, after the war, cannot go back to Canada, which is where he had grown up, because that remains British. The Revolution divides North America. The British Empire persists in Canada. And then you've got the new United States. So he goes and he lives with the Oneidas, who lived in central New York State. And there he becomes a leader of the Oneidas, but the Oneidas have a very difficult experience. Even though they've been American allies, they're under enormous pressure from the state of New York to give up most of their lands. And Colonel Louie gets caught in the middle of that. And so it's not entirely a happy story, his later life. And indeed, for most of the Oneidas, they end up being very disappointed in their dreams of what they thought a Patriot victory would mean for them.
Okay. All right, we can move ahead. There we go.
Okay. So I showed you that map before that showed the proclamation line. And here, and I know that you've had the chance to read the whole proclamation, and here is just one excerpt from it, which is, in effect, about the meaning of that line. And so I raised some questions here, and I just want to identify the first one, is that there's a problem in this document that the British Crown are trying to solve. And I think it would be helpful with students to ask them that question. What is it that the British see as the problem here? And who do they think is creating that problem?
Okay. Okay, what problems do the British see here?
You can see it right there on the first line of the document.
Okay. Well, they're having frauds and abuses are being committed against the Indians. There we go. Purchasing lands from the Indians. Okay. So the settlers are moving westward and claiming their land. Sounds as if the settlers are claiming Indian territories, precisely. Okay. And they're not doing it. The British don't think they're doing it honestly, apparently. Frauds and abuses.
Yeah, so the suggestion here is that their own colonists are in the wrong. And so you see the British Empire taking the side of the Indians in these controversies. And then you see the clause, to the great prejudice of our interests. So it's saying that the interests of the empire are being hurt by this settler invasion of the lands of the Indians.
Now, what interest would the British have to prevent their colonists from moving westward? It would seem to me they would be, right, as they moved westward, they would take more territory. They would be able to have more natural resources, which got sent back to Britain. So why, they don't want to stir up trouble with the Indians, but they have the military force to defeat the Indians. So why are they trying to constrain them to the eastern seaboard?
Well, that's a good question, and part of it is because in the Mississippi Valley, once you go over the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, you're in the Mississippi watershed. And it's very difficult to move any kind of commodity back over those mountains to the east. So they know that if farmers go to the west of those mountains and settle in Kentucky and Tennessee, they're going to float all of their produce, all of their grain, their tobacco, their livestock down the Mississippi, and it's going to end up in the hands of the Spanish because the Spanish were occupying New Orleans. So they see any settlement to the west of the mountains is not going to benefit the economy of the British Empire. It's going to benefit the Spanish. That's one reason.
Okay.
Second reason is the primary way that the British want to exploit that part of the continent is through the fur trade. And they are doing business with the Indians. The Indians are the hunters. They don't really want to deal with colonial hunters. And the Indians are very good hunters. And the Indians want to participate in the fur trade. They get British manufactured goods, including guns, from the British in exchange for their furs. Now, if settlers move in and chop down the trees and kill off the wild animals, that's bad for the fur trade. And then there's a third reason, which is if the settlers move to the west, they're going to provoke a war with the Indians. And that means the British are going to have to send troops in to try to separate the settlers from the Indians. And that's going to be expensive. And one thing the British are trying to do during the 1760s is they're trying to cut their costs because they're deeply in debt from waging this war against the French. So they're trying to raise new tax revenues from the colonists, and they're trying to cut their costs at the same time so they can pay off this national debt or reduce the national debt. So for all these three reasons, they don't want settlers moving west of the mountains. They want to avoid war, they want to avoid helping the Spanish Empire, and they want to preserve the fur trade.
Okay, good. We have about an hour, Alan.
Okay. So the second question here is, what solution did the proclamation offer to that problem? How do the British propose to stop these frauds and abuses?
Okay. Well, we've got clearly there they're saying you can't buy land from the Indians anymore. They're declaring the lands out of bounds. And John Timmerman asks, isn't this that same time as Pontiac?
Yes, it is, because the Indians had risen up in rebellion against British forts in the West in 1763, and the British Crown knows this is going on, and they are hoping that this proclamation will help to bring that war to an end.
Okay, all right. So the British are telling their colonists you can't buy land from the Indians anymore. Did they do anything else to prevent settlement to the
Well,
west?
it's interesting. It says no private person may do so. So the window that's left open is that a colonial governor could do so. And if anyone's had the opportunity to read the whole document, there's a contradiction in this proclamation in that it authorizes the royal governors to make these land grants to former soldiers of the war against the French. And so on the one hand, it's saying, well, colonial governors have to manage this process, and they have to provide these land grants to these former officers. But then it's saying that no private person can go out there and get lands from the Indians. So the British are trying to get control over their frontier, and they want their governors to be in control of the process of limited and regulated process of slowly acquiring in some Indian land. And they don't want the colonists to do this on their own.
Okay.
Well, I see a question here about royal governors had tremendous power. The Crown wanted the royal governors to have a lot of power, and it would seem that if this royal proclamation could be enforced, that those governors would have power. But the problem always was that the Crown and the governors found it very difficult to enforce their authority over colonists when colonists wanted to do something else.
All right.
Now, the third question here is, when the revolution did come, would most of the Indians side with the British or the colonists, and why?
Okay. Okay. Any comments on that? Why would they were aligning with the colonists, presumably to keep the they were aligning with the British, presumably to keep the colonists out of their territories. They would get a better deal at the hands of the British.
That's absolutely the case. Now, again, there will be a few exceptions. The Oneida are the prime exception. But overwhelmingly, the Indians will ally with the British because they hope the British will help them to keep their homelands and to preserve them from this settler invasion.
Now we have a comment here from Christopher. Some shows the French. How did the French figure into all this at this point?
Well, in the previous war, most of them had sided with the French, but the French are kind of out of the picture now. They've been forced out of North America. When the French do become allies of the United States tries to use that and tries to, for example, they bring Indians in to meet Lafayette, hoping that Lafayette can persuade these Indians to leave their British alliance and to form an alliance with the United States. But Lafayette and the French aren't that persuasive, and so that doesn't really make a difference. Just about all of the Indians will remain British allies through this war.
Okay, and here we have a question from Amy. How did the natives feel about the contradiction over the land given to royal governors?
Well, the royal governors tended to pay the Indians a better price. They actually would pay. So if they have to sell to somebody, they would rather sell to a royal governor. The other thing is that the royal governors were buying a bit less land. It's the lesser of the two evils in the Indian perspective.
One thing I've often wondered about this, when the Indians sold their land, did the money they received really do them all that much good? It would seem to me that the land would be worth more. Did they really come out well in those deals?
Well, by yes and no. They would prefer not to sell. Mm-hmm. But sometimes they're in situations where the pressure is so overwhelming that they have to sell in order to keep the peace. And so when they do have to sell, they want to get the best price they can. They're usually not being paid in money. They're usually being paid in trade goods. And they're trade goods that they'd very much like to have: bolts of cloth, guns, gunpowder, mirrors. Native peoples have become very heavily engaged in the export market. They cannot produce these guns or this cloth or these mirrors or this jewelry themselves. To get it, they have to either engage in the fur trade or they have to sell land.
And Joe asked, what kind of pressures were put on them to sell their land?
Well, the pressure will come in that settlers are moving in, and they're coming in very large numbers. And governors will just say to them, look, maybe you should sell it to us instead of, just losing it for nothing to those settlers. And if you give us some land, we'll do our best to try to keep the settlers out of the rest of your land.
I see. Okay. Is there any relationship between Native Americans that sold land and federal recognition now? Somebody's looking ahead. Any looking forward to that?
Well, this is also a good question. There's no direct relationship. The Oneidas are an interesting case. The Oneidas had helped the United States a great deal during the Revolution, and they suffered a great deal after the Revolution, and they lost almost all of their lands. They then had to struggle during the 1970s and 1980s to get federal recognition because the federal government wanted to say that the Oneidas had either all moved to Canada or all moved to Wisconsin, and they didn't want to recognize a very small group of Oneidas that had persisted in New York. But eventually the courts ruled in the favor of the Oneidas in New York State. But there are other nations. The Mashpee Indians have had a long struggle to get federal recognition, even though they had supported the United States during the Revolution. So generally the case in federal recognition is if you seem like a large group of Indians that have stayed pretty much where you used to be historically, then it's easier for you to get historical recognition than if you were a native people that were greatly reduced in number and had lost virtually all of your lands.
Now, one quick question from Vicki before we move on. Weren't most of the Indians moved westward? Wasn't it pretty much a southern phenomenon, the Cherokees moving westward?
Well, a great number of Indians were moved westward. The Cherokees are the famous example. But I believe it could be said that in just about all of the eastern states east of the Mississippi, there are still Indian peoples. There are Indian peoples in Maine, in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, New York State, certainly. I know of native communities in Virginia. These tend to be very small communities because they've lost virtually all of their land. And a lot of Eastern Indians, because there isn't enough land for them to live as a community, they live in the midst of non-native peoples in the East.
Okay, well, Alan, shall we move on to the next document?
Okay. Now, here is a document from 1793, so this is after the Revolution. And although the war between the United States and the British is over, the War of the American Revolution actually persists in the area that was called the Northwest Territory, which meant north and west of the Ohio River. So it was the area that now includes the states of Ohio and Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That area was still in the possession of Indian peoples. And they didn't want to give up their lands, even though the Treaty of Peace had drawn this boundary that pushed the British to the north of the Great Lakes and had cast these Indians within the boundaries of the United States. These Indians insisted they were still independent peoples, and that they had not been conquered by the United States, and they didn't want to give up their lands. So in this particular quote, the Indians are saying to the United States, we don't want to accept your settlers in our country, and we have a different solution to this conflict, which is, remove those settlers. And they have quite a sophisticated alternative proposal that they present to American negotiators in 1793. So I would just invite you to kind of read this and to identify what their solution is.
Okay. Well, shall we put it out there? Why don't I give it a crack reading it and get it in front of everybody? Brothers, we know that these settlers are poor, or they would never have ventured to live in a country which have been in continual trouble ever since they crossed the Ohio. Divide, therefore, this large sum of money which you have offered us among these people. Give to each also a portion of what you say you would give us annually over and above this very large sum of money. And we are persuaded they would most readily accept of it in lieu of the lands you sold to them. If you add also the great sums you must expend in raising and paying armies, with a view to force us to yield to you our country, you will certainly have more than sufficient for the purposes of repaying these settlers for all their labors and improvements. Okay, and Yvonne writes, the money that was to be used to compensate the indigenous groups to be given to the colonists. And Jessica thinks that's a great compromise. They are indeed very sophisticated, wheelers and dealers.
Well, you can see that they're thinking very proactively here, and they want to keep their lands. And so they're saying to the United States, you're going to have to spend a lot of money fighting us, and you're offering us money for these lands, so why don't you just take the money and pay the settlers to stay east of the Ohio River?
And how did the United States react to this proposal?
Well, what's your guess?
Okay, let's put it to the participants. How do you think the United States reacted to this proposal? Did we leap at it, or did we say no? Thanks, but no thanks, Yvonne says. Any other comments? So, Alan, did the United States say thanks, but no thanks to the Indians?
Okay, well, you're all quite correct that the United States is not going to go for it, though I see a lot of you thought this was an excellent solution to the problem. So why do you suppose that the United States would not accept this as a solution to the problem?
Okay, why wouldn't the United States? John says arrogance. Any other possible expansions? Expansion? They did not want to allow the expansion. Okay. Yeah, weren't we having some population growth here, and perhaps the United States saw it as if it wasn't in the British interest to move westward. Does the United States see that it is in their interest, its interest, to have its population move westward? There we go. Manifest destiny, control issues. Nothing was going to get in the way of the westward creep. Okay, Alan, do you think we've nailed it here?
Well, you're certainly on the right track, that the United States is committed to expansion, and they're not going to accept a proposal that's going to define a permanent boundary and say the United States has to stay to the east of that boundary. That was, of course, the British idea in the Royal Proclamation. So here the Indians are essentially saying, we like that concept of the proclamation of a permanent boundary in which we will stay in our country and you'll stay in yours. The United States is saying, no way, we have to expand. And that question becomes, why does the United States have to expand? The Americans believe that if they don't expand, their country will fail.
And on what grounds would it fail? Why do they believe that, Alan?
Well, part of it is the United States is deeply in debt. It's deeply in debt for the American Revolution, and it's got to finance that debt. It has to pay the annual interest on the debt. And one of the prime ways in which this new government is financing itself is by selling lands to land speculators and to settlers. Mm-hmm. So if the Indians say, no, you're not going to sell our lands and settle these lands, then that's bad news for the finances of the new republic. And then the other reason is this is an agricultural country, the United States. The people of the United States are farmers, mostly, and they want to stay farmers. They want their children to be farmers. Population is growing very rapidly. And so if their kids are going to stay farmers, they're going to have to get farms. And to get those farms, they're going to have to move to the West. And so for these reasons, the United States just believes that the country will fail if they cannot expand into Indian country and turn Indian lands into private property, and in particular to turn it into farms.
Mm-hmm. And we had a number of people make similar comments in the chat, citing Jefferson's idea of the yeoman farmer and Hamilton's emphasis on financing the debt. So they're right on target.
Certainly, Hamilton is the primary person who's designing the finances of this new country. So he makes it quite clear that the U.S. needs to sell those lands that are in Indian possession. And Thomas Jefferson's vision is of a nation which will continue to expand so that it can provide farms. He believes that a Republican form of government, this is small r Republican, requires there to be a very broad middle-class electorate of people who can support themselves off their own property. And that means a farm. And given the growing population, you cannot sustain the kind of Republican government that Jefferson wanted unless you're creating hundreds of new farms every year.
And hence the need for land.
And hence the need to take the Indians' land and turn it into the land of the United States.
Okay. We've got about 45 minutes left, Alan. Shall we move on?
Sure. Now we're going into some images which are about the black participation in the Revolution. And here, too, most of the blacks who fought in the Revolution fought on the British side. And just as the Indians hoped that the British would help them to preserve their lands, African Americans hoped that the British would give them freedom as a reward for fighting against the Patriots. Now, there were some blacks who did fight on the side of the Patriots, particularly in the northern states. Blacks would enlist in Continental Army units. And by the end of the Revolution, about 10% of Washington's Continental Army consisted of African Americans. almost entirely from the north. Now here's a famous image from early in the war. This is a painting. This is another John Trumbull painting. And here again we've got an American officer dying in a heroic moment, Battle of Bunker Hill. And this is General Warren, who is the central figure there, about to be bayoneted by a British soldier. But the image I want to call to your attention is in the far right, and this is a man named Peter Salem. And he's African American, and he did fight in this battle on the Patriot side. And you can also see in the center of the picture, this is an interesting painting because there are actually two figures who are dying, and one of the figures is a British soldier who's dying just to the right of center. That's Major Pitcairn. And it is believed that Peter Salem shot him during this battle. So this is a rare case in which an American patriotic painting actually includes an African American. Usually, although there were African Americans fighting in these battles, in most of these paintings, you can't find a black face in these American patriotic paintings of the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, this is another patriotic American painting. This shows the Battle of Cowpens. And here, too, you see it's a rare image in which an African American is shown, and he's fighting on the Patriot side. And he is on the right side of this picture. And he actually was a slave, and he belonged to an American cavalry officer, a man known as Light Horse Harry Lee. And here, his slave is shown fighting beside his master against the British in this Battle of Cowpens, which occurred in South Carolina in 1780.
And Amy notes here that he's shown in an aggressive stance, which would be
well, he's shown firing a weapon,
right.
But it's also interesting that he's shown as being, his horse is shown as smaller and he's shown as smaller. Now, he was certainly younger, but there's a way in which he's out of scale with the white figures in the painting. So it's a way in which the artist is conveying a kind of diminutive sense of black people's participation in this war.
Mm-hmm. Is he in uniform?
Well, he is wearing the green uniform of this particular regiment. And but he was not considered an enlisted man. He's considered the slave of his owner, who is the commander of the regiment.
Right, and Stephen notes that his horse's head is down where the others are raised up.
Right.
So again, that puts him in a
subordinate position. That's a very good observation.
Is that a trumpet on his side there? Do I see?
I believe it is. Yes. So he's a bugler.
Bugler. Okay. And Joe says he looks like a boy among men, echoing your point. Yeah.
Indeed, and so it was then a common practice to refer to even grown African American men as boys. And this image, which is done by a Southern artist in the middle of the 19th century, is trying to reinforce the dominance of the white race, even when it's including an African American figure.
Mm-hmm. What year was it done? Do you know?
This is 1850s, I believe. I'm trying to see if I can read on the. It's a William Ranney painting, but I don't see. It says courtesy from the South Carolina State House, so it's on public display there. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that it's 1850s.
I see. So we have some echoes of the loyal slave here as the nation runs up to the Civil War.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, so these two images are kind of rare images from American patriotic painting showing blacks fighting on the American side. We have virtually no images from the British side, even though much larger numbers of African Americans fought in British units during the war. And that's in large part because the British just didn't want to paint about this war. They didn't end up winning the war. So they don't have the same reason to produce these epic paintings about the war that the United States had. And so we have kind of a skew. We see very few black faces in these historic paintings. And what we do see come from the Patriot side.
Before we move on from this, Janine makes the point that she makes a point about the use of light, and it seems that the black clouds, seem to cluster around the slave. Yet another way, I think, to emphasize the kind of marginal roles that the artist is suggesting the slaves played.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I hadn't noticed that, but I think that's certainly a very astute observation.
Mm-hmm. And Kelly Cotton notes, interesting how the role of blacks is being downplayed, and yet wasn't Crispus Attucks portrayed as a martyr being slaughtered by the British at the Boston Massacre?
Well, it's interesting that at the time of the Boston Massacre, the Patriots will certainly make the most of all of the victims of it, but they avoid identifying Crispus Attucks as either an Indian or a black, and he's another one of these characters who is both. So they try to downplay his racial difference in order to make him a martyr. Now, in recent years, particularly in school text, now that we're trying to recover the black experience in the Revolution, there's a tendency to play up Crispus Attucks and to be very clear about identifying him as an African American. But that's relatively new, and it's as a result of the somewhat different culture that we live in today compared to the 1770s.
All right. Any other questions about this image before we move ahead? Any other comments? Was this perhaps made with a political motive to ingratiate Southerners with slaves? From Amy, did you think the artist had any contemporary motives in the 1850s other than perhaps suggesting the loyal slave?
Well, he certainly wants to say that, in effect, slaves are content being slaves.
Yeah. And
that their role in the Revolution was a limited one, and it was that of being a slave standing side by side with their masters. And the historical reality is that thousands of slaves ran away from Patriot masters during the Revolution and went to the British lines in order to help them. And thousands of them ended up being evacuated as refugees and settled in the Bahamas or in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm. So if people were to teach this, they would have to be they have to realize that the battle is taking place in 1780, but the painting is being done in the 1850s, and it resonates heavily in that period, the 1850s.
Right, and I also see a question here about the cotton gin. Certainly slavery was extremely important in the South before the cotton gin, because there are other valuable crops that they raised in the South. In South Carolina, the chief crops were rice and indigo, very valuable crops, and they employed thousands of slaves. So that in South Carolina at the time of the Revolution, 2/3 of the people living in South Carolina were slaves, even though they weren't raising cotton at that time. Now, when cotton becomes a major crop after 1793, it's going to increase the profits of owning slaves, and it's going to lead to a great expansion westward of the slave system, because rice and indigo are good crops for growing along the coast. They're not good crops for growing in the interior, but in the interior you can grow cotton. So what cotton does is it provides a powerful economic incentive for expanding the slave system westward into places like Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas and on into Texas. Slavery is very, very profitable before the cotton gin, particularly in South Carolina, because rice is such a valuable crop. And we've kind of forgotten about that because we think the South is all about cotton. Now slavery was losing a bit of its profitability in Virginia because tobacco was exhausting the soil. But slavery had been very profitable up until about the 1760s in Virginia. Now, after that, there's kind of a concern that tobacco is exhausting the land and slavery is becoming less profitable. But with the cotton boom, the Virginians are going to find they can do a very good business selling their slaves to these new plantations in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana.
Okay. All right. Shall we move on then, Alan?
Okay.
To the next image.
Now, this is the last image, and then we're going to go to the documents. And this was done by a German, what we call a Hessian, who was captured by the Americans, and he produced this very interesting sketch of Continental Army soldiers. And because he's not an American and he's not producing a kind of epic patriotic painting, he's just sketching what he saw at the time that he saw it. This is a more revealing image. And this shows a variety of uniforms that would be worn in the Continental Army. You can see there isn't any standardization. This particular viewer is frankly showing you that there are black soldiers in the Continental Army. And you have on the far left, you have a black soldier in the midst, side by side with 3 white soldiers.
What is the fellow on the right holding?
Well, he is holding a fuse, and he's an artilleryman. So it's essentially a lighted fuse, and he would use this to light and set off a cannon.
Okay. And can we tell anything about the regiments the people served in from these uniforms, or are they pretty generic?
You probably could, but I can't tell you what they are, what the different. You can certainly see the man who is holding a rifle that is parallel to the ground. He's a rifleman. He's wearing a hunting shirt. So these riflemen would largely be from Virginia and from Pennsylvania, from the frontier regions. And you can see that strapped to his back, he's carrying a tomahawk. So the riflemen fight very much in what we would call an Indian fashion. And they are armed in an Indian fashion with rifles and with tomahawks instead of bayonets. Now, the man who's to the left of center, and the 2 men who are to the left of center are both armed with muskets, and they have bayonets. And most of the soldiers in the Continental Army were not armed with rifles. They were armed with muskets and bayonets, and they fight in a very European style, which is what Washington wanted to do. He wanted a European-style army. Although the legend is that Americans all fought in an Indian style, the reality was that some units did, the riflemen, but the core of Washington's army fought in a European style, and they were drilled by Baron von Steuben to fight in the European way.
Patty Walker makes the point that this is looks like a diverse population. Could you just comment on the diversity of the colonies at this point?
Well, yeah, it was a very diverse place. We think of it as a very kind of English place, but only a minority of the people living in the colonies were of English descent. They're the largest single group, but there are all sorts of people who are from Scotland, from Northern Ireland, from Germany, from the Netherlands, and there are 1/5 of the American people were African Americans. So there was a higher proportion of African Americans living in the America of 1776 than in the America of today. That's proportion I want to emphasize, a much smaller overall population. But 1 in every 5 Americans was an African American in 1776, and almost all of them were slaves.
Okay. Any other comments or questions about this image before we move on? Someone had noted that since the artist was German and had no vested interest in America's racial arrangements, the African American figure is of equal size to the others. No need to make him look subordinate or marginal.
Yeah, that's certainly a good observation.
Okay, then, Al, shall we move on? We've got about 30 minutes left.
Okay. So this first document is a petition sent to the state legislature of Massachusetts. Now, I want to emphasize that at the start of the Revolution, slavery could be found in every single colony. It was perfectly legal in every colony. So these slaves have to struggle to become free. And here we have a case where slaves in Massachusetts have written a petition to their state legislature seeking their freedom. And what's interesting here is the argument that they put forward. What are they saying to these legislators to try to persuade those legislators that they ought to set the slaves free?
Okay, why don't we put it on the table for everyone? It have never been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of their unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of your petitioners. They therefore humble beseech your honors to cause an act of the legislature to be passed, whereby they may be restored to the enjoyments of that which is the natural right of all men, and their children who were born in this land of liberty may not be held as slaves after they arrive at the age of 21 years. So may the inhabitants of this state no longer be chargeable with the inconstancy of acting themselves that part which they condemn and oppose in others. Okay, so what's the argument here, folks? Okay, Amy notes this petition is talking about the hypocrisies of the Americans. Any other comments? I see they're using the natural rights rhetoric. I mean, we've heard that before in this point, the Declaration of Independence, and certainly in the air at the time. Using the language of the Declaration of Independence, Yvonne notes, calling upon the ideals of the revolution. Here Joe writes, as the colonies would never submit to the English based on the principles they believe we will not live under those same rights and principles, right? Okay. We've had a couple of questions here about reaching maturity. People are saying that when they're 21, they should not be held as slaves after that. Okay.
Well, let me just say something about that, is that a slave would be put to work usually when they're about 10 or 11 years old. So what they're proposing here is what's called gradual emancipation. And so they're seeking something that they think will be a little more palatable to their masters, which is to put the masters on notice that you get to work these slaves until they're 21, and then they become free. So these slaves believe that if they pitch it that way rather than immediate emancipation, that they're more likely to get the state legislature to go along with their proposal.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments here? Okay. Isn't it coincidence to raise them the first 10 years when they are unproductive? So is it an inconvenience to raise them in the first 10 years when they're unproductive?
Well, they're not unproductive. They're less productive than they will be in their 20s, but you can get a lot of work out of somebody who's 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And they do, particularly if it's farm work or if it's work on the docks. The thing is, most white kids are working when they're 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. There's no child labor laws in that world. And most people aren't going to school, or they're going to school for a very limited time in the winter when there isn't much employment. But most of the kids in colonial America, white or black, are working on farms when they're 10, 11, 12, 13 years old.
Janine notes that's what the students find so surprising, that such young children went through such conditions, white or non-white, no school. Okay. Amy writes, who would actually have written this? Obviously, this slave had some sort of education.
Right. Well, you can tell that this is a person who's not well educated. There are a lot of errors of grammar and of spelling in it. But it is somebody who obviously has thought these things through and probably self-educated. Perhaps somebody's made an effort to teach him a bit of the Bible. But you would find a lot of white people of that time who would write documents very much like this.
And we have no idea who the author is. This is an anonymous piece.
Well, no, there are signers to this, but in the website that provided this, they do not indicate the name of any of the signers.
Okay. Okay. And
I don't believe Prince Hall wrote this, though. That's certainly an interesting suggestion because Prince Hall was from Massachusetts. It's possible, though, so I don't want to rule that out. But I don't recognize this as a Prince Hall document.
Okay. Before we move on, what was the fate of this petition?
Well, it's not passed into law by the legislature. So slaves were a very small proportion of the Massachusetts population. They were about 5% in Massachusetts in 1777. But even there, they're considered valuable property, and the people who tend to own them tend to be politically well-connected people, and they don't want to lose their property. So slavery will be abolished in Massachusetts by a court decision in 1780, when some slaves bring a lawsuit against their masters and say, in effect, they're kidnappers. And they cited the language of the Massachusetts state constitution, which had been adopted in 1780. No, excuse me, the liberation comes in 1783, and the state constitution of 1780 had used some universalistic language similar to the Declaration of Independence. And the court ruled in favor and said slavery is immediately, it's already illegal under the Massachusetts Constitution. So slaves in Massachusetts are all set free at once. There is no gradual emancipation. It's sudden, and it's in 1783, but it's because of a court case, because the democratic political process was not one that was being responsive to them. They weren't voters, and the voters of Massachusetts mostly wanted to keep slavery.
And did this petition get debated in the legislature?
This petition did get debated, and it got tabled, so it didn't go anywhere. Okay. And they did have white attorneys who were arguing their case. So there were people who were sympathetic to these slaves, quite a substantial number of people. They just weren't sufficient to prevail in the legislature, and that's why they turned to the courts.
Okay. Any other comments or questions about this petition before we move on? Anything else? Any other points to make, Alan?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, let's move on to the next document.
Well, I do just want to say that it's, you know, in all of these documents, we will see blacks being very proactive in pressing for their freedom. And sometimes we can tell the story of kind of this white top-down emancipation, and we lose sight of the ways in which blacks are doing their very best to try to press for freedom for themselves.
Okay.
Now, here's a document from the British side of the story. This is issued by Virginia's royal governor, the Earl of Dunmore, in 1775 in the fall. And so, Richard, I'll have you read this then.
Okay. I do hereby further declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the most speedily reducing of this colony to a proper sense of their duty. All right.
So this is a very interesting offer that's made. And so the first question is Dunmore offering freedom to all of the slaves in Virginia?
Okay. Is he offering all of the slaves freedom? What do we think about that? No. Well, and someone else says yes. So now we have a debate on our hands. Only the ones that can fight. Okay. Great way to get good troops who will fight for their cause. Okay. He does limit it. The slaves, Negroes, and others appertaining to the rebels. So
there are loyalists in Virginia, as there are in every one of the colonies. These are Americans who are loyal to the empire. He's not setting free any of the slaves that belong to loyalists. He's just saying, those of you who belong to rebels, you are the ones I'm willing to free. Then there's another restriction, which is you have to come and join me, and you have to be able and willing to bear arms. So it doesn't seem to be inviting women and children or old people to get free. He just wants to raise a force of black soldiers who are willing to fight for their freedom.
How did the loyalist slaveholders respond to this? I can see where they would like to defeat the patriots. But did they worry that this emancipation for the patriot slaves would cause discontent among their own?
Well, that's kind of part of the third question here. So I'd kind of let's hold off on that for a moment. Let's just do because it's a great question. Let's do the second question, which is what is Dunmore trying to achieve with this promise?
Okay. Well, he wanted more bodies to fight, as Vicky says. What else is he trying to achieve? Let's see.
Well, I see Patty had said weaken the colonists.
Right. Right.
And he wants to do both. And if the slaves run away, they're not working for their masters, and that's going to hurt the economy of the patriots. And if they're coming and joining his forces, that gives him more men to fight against the patriots.
Mm-hmm. And Patty notes confusion from within, cripple the rebels, and he'll develop a stronger army. Yeah, he would deny the patriots the source of their own wealth and their supplies, really. Okay.
And I see Janine has an interesting comment there about how this must have caused conflict within families. And that's a very good point, which is blacks who are running away from the rebels really are taking an enormous risk, because they're going to have to pass through the patriot lines, and they could be caught. And also, if they go, they might get freedom for themselves. Let's imagine they're young men, which most of them would be. They get freedom for themselves, but they're leaving behind parents and sisters and younger brothers and wives or girlfriends. So there are a lot of slaves that just can't bring themselves to, even though they want freedom, they can't bring themselves to leave their families and their communities. And so most of the slaves of Virginia, even though they have rebel masters, won't run away. But several thousands did run away. And as the war goes on, they increasingly tell the British, if you want my services as a soldier, you got to let me bring my children and my wife with me, and you got to help to feed them, and you got to promise them a refuge after the war.
Well, did they? Did they allow the slaves to bring their families with them?
They did toward the end. But some of the time, the British are running short on food for their own troops. And then there's an enormous tragedy at the Battle of Yorktown, which is the big battle at the end of the war, which is an enormous victory for the Patriots. And it's the reason why the British make peace. But there's a tragedy there for thousands of slaves who had taken refuge with the British. And they suffer from camp diseases, and hundreds and thousands of them die. They're suffering from malnutrition, and at the end of the battle, the British can't feed them anymore, and they push them out. They just send them off into the Patriot lines, where they're grabbed and put back into slavery, and then a lot of them just don't survive the hunger and the disease. So it ends up at the very end of the war in Virginia being a great tragedy for thousands of blacks who had found refuge behind British lines. And then the British end up losing this big battle, and it's a tragedy for these African Americans.
And did the British make any provisions for those African Americans after the war? Did they evacuate some of them, or were they just left to their own devices?
They did. They evacuated probably about 6,000 of them end up being evacuated, and we're going to come to a document about that evacuation that's coming right up. Now, Patty has a comment about smallpox. Smallpox is the #1 killer. These slaves have not been inoculated, and they're being all kind of thrust together into these crowded camps. But it's not just smallpox, it's also dysentery, which is the great camp disease. Africans are not immune to malaria or smallpox. They have a little higher resistance to malaria than do white people, but it's just a little bit. And as for smallpox, they are equally subject to it as white people.
Okay. And Sue has a question. What was the ratio of Africans and other indentured individuals to free men, I guess, in Virginia at this time?
In Virginia, 40% of the people were slaves, and probably about another 5% were indentured servants. So this invitation is being extended to indentured servants as well. Now, some of these blacks who run away belong to George Washington. So you got some of the famous patriots who owned some of the slaves who run away to the Earl of Dunmore in 1775. And they will continue to run away to the British through this war.
Okay.
Now,
Are there any questions?
The last question you had raised, Richard, about how would white Virginians react to this proclamation. And as you expected, a lot of loyalists said, "Oh, hold on here. We want the empire united, but we don't like this concept of some slaves being freed." And so a lot of loyalists who'd been maybe a little bit on the fence, they become patriots. So Dunmore's proclamation attracts a lot of blacks to his cause, but it ends up uniting almost all of the whites of Virginia against him.
Oh, so it's a major backfire.
In a way, it's a backfire. He had hoped that it would put pressure on the white people to drop out of the war, but instead it makes them fight harder against him.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the Earl of Dunmore's petition before we move on? We've got about 15 minutes remaining. Okay, Alan, shall we go ahead?
Okay. Now, this is a document from the Evacuation of New York, and this is written by a man named Boston King, who is a former slave who has run away to the British lines. The British occupied New York City through the war. Well, beginning in 1776, they captured it, and they held it until 1783, when they made the peace treaty, and they have to evacuate their forces. And it makes the slaves who are refugees within, the former slaves who are refugees within New York City, extremely anxious, particularly when some of their masters show up in the city seeking to grab them. And this is a very vivid quote about the plight of these refugees who expect the worst.
Okay, shall we read it? A report prevailed at New York that all the slaves in number 2,000 were to be divided up to their masters. Delivered up to their masters, although some of them had been 3 or 4 years among the English. This dreadful rumor filled us all with inexpressible anguish and terror, especially when we saw our old masters come, and seizing upon their slaves in the streets of New York, or even dragging them out of their beds. For some days we lost our appetite for food, and sleep departed from our eyes. Okay. So here we have a question: were any of them able to escape with the British? Any slaves able to escape with the British, Alan?
Yes, the British intervened and said no, and told these masters to back off. George Washington protested and said, by the peace treaty, you're supposed to give us our slaves back. And the British said, no, that's not the way we interpret the peace treaty. We've made promises to these people. We promised them freedom. They're not slaves anymore. They're free people. And we're going to stick by our promises. And so they evacuated these slaves, almost all of them. And they took them up to Nova Scotia, where they were settled, and they were given some land. Now, it's not entirely a happy story, because the white people of Nova Scotia had every bit the same prejudices as the white people of the new United States. And so the climate of Nova Scotia was one that a lot of these slaves found very harsh. And Nova Scotia is not a good place to make a living as a farmer. It's got very bad soil. So most of these slaves then would be relocated during the 1790s. They will move on to Africa, and they will be settled in a special British colony on the coast of Africa called Sierra Leone. So you've got thousands of Americans, former Americans, who have this very complex exodus, where they run away to British lines during the war, they're relocated to Nova Scotia during the early 1780s, and then a decade later they will be relocated to the shore of Africa as colonists of a new British colony called Sierra Leone.
And John asked about Liberia.
Well, Liberia is an American colony on the coast of Africa that is founded very near Sierra Leone, and for a somewhat similar reason. When Americans did end up freeing some slaves, they didn't like having free blacks around. And so they encouraged these free blacks to move back to Africa. And there were programs to subsidize those who would be willing to go back to Africa, and they were settled in Liberia. And this especially happened during the 1820s.
Okay. Any other questions about the slaves in New York or in general, evacuation, and how the British took care of them? which is, let me see here, and didn't Liberia end up having its own form of slavery within 20 to 25 years?
Well, I don't know the history of Liberia that well, so I kind of hesitate to say, but there certainly were conflicts between the American blacks who arrived and then the native peoples who had lived along that coast and were not invited to be part of Liberia, except as, in effect, kind of the same role that the Indians had to play in the western United States. And again, Liberia was not the idea of these free blacks. They were kind of pressured into doing this. Now, some of them did embrace the Liberia option because they just felt that racial prejudice was so great within the United States that there really wasn't a future for black people here. But most African Americans, the overwhelming majority, did not want to go to Liberia and did not go to Liberia. They wanted to stay in the United States and fight for freedom and equality.
And Amy Hinton notes that this idea of locating the blacks got resurrected during Lincoln's time. Did he want to relocate blacks?
Well, at a certain point in his political career, when he's trying to persuade particularly the Upper South, to adopt some kind of gradual emancipation, and they're all saying, yeah, but we'll be left with a lot of black people, free black people around. We don't want that. So Lincoln's floating different trial balloons. There's a suggestion maybe a lot of them could go to Haiti, or maybe a lot of them could be moved off to Liberia. It's never truly practical. And Lincoln ends up not really pressing it very far once he figures out it's not practical. And it's not going to really persuade the slave masters in the Upper South. So it's a trial balloon that goes nowhere for Lincoln.
And Stephen asked, do we know about how many slaves escaped with the British? How many they took with them?
Well, there's been a lot of back and forth among historians. You see some figures that are Jefferson said 30,000, and some other estimates go as high as 100,000. But the most careful analyst says that probably about 12,000 escaped to the British, and well, maybe about 15,000. But more than half of them end up dying, mostly of disease. Some of them get recaptured by the Patriots. And probably about 6,000 of them get relocated either to the Bahamas or to Nova Scotia.
Okay. Any other comments or questions on this text before we move on? Did Washington really treat his slaves well? I think we're getting to Washington is coming up.
Well,
in the next.
We're going to get to that. I just want to, the last question here is, this is part of the complexity of the revolution. It goes to the question of how do we make the revolution one that we recover the drama of the time. And that's to recognize that the American patriots have a really good case for liberty, but they don't have a perfect case. And there were thousands of Americans, particularly African Americans, who are looking to the British as the better defenders of liberty. And certainly that's the way Boston King saw it. And so to kind of recover this kind of drama and the ways in which these were not easy times and they were not easy decisions, I found in my teaching career that students respond well to that. They find that makes it a whole lot more interesting than just saying that one side was entirely good and the other side was entirely bad.
Okay, we have a question from John Timmerman. What was the fate of the slaves who were recaptured?
Well, we don't know very much about them. Yet it's an awfully good question. What we do know for some of Thomas Jefferson's slaves who got recaptured, he didn't trust them again. And so what he tended to do was sell them to somebody else. So they become somebody else's problem. He's kind of persuaded if they'll run away once, they'll run away again. So I'd rather they ran away from somebody else. Also, if you sell them away, it's a punishment because you're breaking up their families. They're going to be moved. He made a point of always selling them at a great distance so that they could never come back. They could never see their brothers and sisters. They would never see their wives. And so he tended to sell off any of the slaves he recovered. And I think that was probably pretty widespread. But we just don't have it as well documented for other masters as we have it for Jefferson.
And Laura asks, Are there other documents like this one from Boston King, accounts of blacks who fought for the British?
There are. There's a man named Thomas Peters who wrote very interesting documents about it. There's a book, let me think, there's a book called The Black Loyalists, which is, the author's last name is Walker, but it's called The Black Loyalists, and it tells the story of these blacks who escaped to the British and go on to Nova Scotia and later Sierra Leone. And certainly if you trace the footnotes there, then you can find a lot of documents.
Okay, so then we've got about 5 minutes to go. Shall we move on?
Okay, I may skip past, just quickly do the Cato's letter and petition. Pennsylvania had actually acted to free their slaves in a gradual emancipation law in 1780. But there was a rumor that they were about to reconsider and pass a new law that would restore slavery. And so Cato is a slave who is petitioning the assembly and begging them not to restore the slaves to the former slaves to slavery. And he's making an argument that's very much like the one in the Massachusetts petition, which is basically saying you people are fighting for liberty, and if it's going to be real, it's got to be universal. And you can't fight for your own liberty and hold us in slavery. And if you do, you're probably not going to win because you'll be inconsistent. Now I see John has a good question, and it is true in gradual emancipation laws, the goal of those laws is to free the state of slavery. It's not necessarily to free the slaves in the state. Now let me explain the difference. If it's gradual, you're giving masters due notice that when your slaves turn out to be 21 or 25 or 28, depending on the law, they're going to become free. And some of the masters will then grab those slaves and sell them off to the South so that they get something for them before they turn 25 or 28 and become free. Now, most of the slaves in these northern states that have gradual emancipation do get their freedom, but there are hundreds of them that are just sold into slavery in the South. Because again, the goal of these laws is that these states have decided that they want to be free of slavery and not necessarily to free the slaves. In fact, they would rather there not be free blacks around. Now I'm going to go on. We're getting into the home stretch, and this goes to the George Washington question that some of you raised. And Washington lost slave runaways. He lost them during the Revolution. This is actually a letter from after the Revolution. He continues to lose them. They continue to run away. Now, Washington had a reputation of being probably better than your average slaveholder. But being a slave is being a slave. And you don't have control over yourself. You don't have control over your family. You have this hanging over your head all the time. So the master could hire a new overseer. Washington's away a lot of the time, and he's got overseers who are running his plantation. And an overseer who gets angry at the slaves can order people whipped. And Washington could die. He will die, of course, eventually. And they don't know what's in his will. His will did end up freeing all his slaves, but they don't know that for certain. In fact, Washington was quite clear he didn't want his slaves to know that that's what his will said. He feared that if slaves found out that his will said they'd be freed, that maybe they might poison him. Slaves live a very insecure life. They don't know when a master will just get pissed off at some slave and decide to sell them off and break up a family. They don't know when the master might die, and then they'd be broken up among multiple heirs, or they'll have to be sold off to sell the debts. So even so-called good masters like Washington, who made an effort to make sure the slaves were reasonably well fed and reasonably well clothed and reasonably well housed, even the good masters have slaves run away because people want to be free. But this letter is very revealing. He's writing to Robert Morris, who's another great patriot leader in Philadelphia. He's often called the financier of the Revolution. Washington's upset at some Quakers who had been encouraging his slaves to run away in order to become free in Pennsylvania. And so the question is, who does Washington blame when some of his slaves run away?
Okay, who does he blame? He's blaming himself or someone else? I notice we've got the passive voice there, are tampered with and seduced to leave. So he seems to be pointing the finger at outside agitators. Okay. And we have a question while people are thinking about that. At Mount Vernon, John was told that Washington did not free his slaves upon his death or those of Martha because he was afraid that they would kill Martha too. Anything to that?
Well, there's something to it. The truth is that Washington owned two types of slaves. He owned slaves that were his own property, and then about half of the slaves that were at Mount Vernon or his other farms, because he owned several farms, belonged to Martha. They were so-called dower slaves that she had brought into the marriage. And so Washington cannot free Martha's slaves. He doesn't have that legal power. He can free his own slaves. But he's a little nervous that if he frees his own slaves and not Martha's slaves, that there's going to be Martha's slaves are going to be really unhappy about it. There's going to be a great deal of conflict at Mount Vernon and these other farms. So he says that all of the slaves will be freed when Martha dies, both the dower slaves and his own slaves. Now, when this will then is probated, and Martha then becomes very nervous, and she says, well, wait a minute, now it becomes in the interest of these slaves for my death to happen. So Martha then decides to accelerate the process, and she's the one that decides that the slaves should all be freed right away, with a handful of exceptions. There were a handful of house slaves that she couldn't part with, but all of the rest are set free. And so it's Martha who really accelerates it because of her nervousness.
Okay. Well, Andy Wade notes a contradiction here. Washington thinks the slaves are happy, yet they're susceptible to being tampered with by outside hands. So I think that addresses our first question there. I don't think he did blame himself. He saw other people sowing discontent among the slaves.
Yeah, he kind of thought that if slaves could kind of live in a cocoon with their masters, that they would be contented. But it's when the outside world and other people start exposing slaves to other ideas that they'll lose their happiness, and then they'll run away to try to discover what freedom is like and to try to experience it. And he's kind of persuaded, he believes the slaves, it's not really in the interest of the slaves to leave. So it's inconsistent because he will end up setting these slaves free. So at the end of the day, when he decides he's going to go and meet his maker, he wants to meet God as a man who no longer owns slaves. So at the end of the day, he believes that slavery is wrong. But he also knew that economically he could not maintain his standard of living as a gentleman without these slaves. So he can't bring himself to free them until he's about to die.
We have a question here from John. We've noted that you've said a number of times that slaveholders didn't want freed slaves around. Why not? Why didn't they want free men around?
Well, the most vivid statement of this is in Thomas Jefferson's famous book, Notes in the State of Virginia, and he has a chapter in there where he actually is promoting a plan for gradual emancipation, but he makes very clear that plan, a key part of it, is that the slaves, once they're free, they have to be shipped out back to Africa. And he insists that it's not safe for white people to have a very large population of free blacks around. He believed that blacks would be so angry over having been held in slavery that once they were free and could get guns, that they would seek revenge. And he figured that there would be a race war in Virginia between the whites and the blacks. And it's possible the whites would win and the blacks would be wiped out, or it's possible he believed that the blacks would win and the whites would be wiped out. So he does not believe in the possibility of blacks and whites being able to coexist in freedom. He believes the only way they could coexist was for one to be free and the other to be slave. But he felt that slavery was morally wrong. So the only way he can reconcile all these contradictions is to say the slaves should be freed, and then they need to be kicked out of Virginia and sent across the Atlantic back to Africa. But that's completely implausible. It's just going to cost far too much money, and these blacks don't want to leave. They want to be free people, and they're African Americans. They're not Africans anymore.
Okay, Alan, we have gone slightly over our time. So let's see, do we have one more document? Or yes, we do. Okay, why don't we deal with this one, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, I will just say quickly that this is a pro-slavery petition that is sent to the state legislature in Virginia by white people who are disgusted with all this talk about a possible gradual emancipation law. And they're making the argument that a gradual emancipation law would violate the principles of the revolution. Now, this will be, something of a jolt for us and for students, because we think the Declaration of Independence, with its statement of all men are created equal, is the essence of the revolution. But there were lots of Americans who believed that the essence of the revolution was the protection of private property, that the British taxes had been a threat to private property, and that's why we'd fought the revolution. And these people, these slave owners, believed that slaves were a legitimate form of private property, and that no government could intervene to take away private property from its owners. And so they are invoking the revolution to say, we are the defenders of the revolution, and what the revolution was about was protecting private property. And this is an ongoing fight in this country as to how much power should government have over private property.
Right, and this argument becomes very important 70 years later as the country is debating slavery and secession.
That's right. So the South will secede because they fear that federal government in the hands of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party of that day would undermine their property, meaning the Southerners' property in slaves.
Okay. Well, Alan, any other points to make about this before we wrap things up?
I don't have anything more to say, but if there's any last questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, we have here wondering why this, they state that the lawbreakers, right, Janine is asking why they considered the people lawbreakers when they were considered property with no rights, basically. So how could a piece of property break the law, I suppose?
Well, what they're fearing is that if blacks become free, that's the second paragraph, and this addresses the question of why do they fear black freedom? They believe that if the blacks were set free, that they would become violent criminals and they would be attacking the white people. And so there's this word banditti, that's like bandits, and revengeful. So you see that Thomas Jefferson's argument about how it's not safe to have free blacks around was a widely held belief among white Southerners. Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your participation this evening. We will monitor the forum until March 25th. So if you have any other questions or comments to make, please go to the forum, put them there, and we will check that out and get back in touch with you to respond to your questions. Our next seminar in Bringing History Alive will be on May 17th, be about the Constitutional Convention, and that will be led by Professor Carol Birkin from the City University of New York. Again, I want to thank all of you for your intelligent participation tonight. Alan, I want to thank you particularly for giving us a wonderful seminar. To escape the classroom, you go up to the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the word File. Click on that. The drop-down menu will say something like Leave the Session. Click on that, and you're home free. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation, and we'll see you again in May. Thank you, and good evening.